Hi, come on in, pull up a seat, welcome. If you're new here, my name is Dan, and if you're not, you already knew that. This video is for the absolute beginner woodworker, the novice. I'm gonna build the most basic box with the simplest set of tools that you can possibly do, and I'm gonna walk you through it. The only materials you really need are a piece of board. This would be listed as 6 inches. This is 5.5 inches wide, 6 feet long. This is pine. You could use poplar. You could really use any kind of wood you want. I happen to have pine on hand. It's inexpensive. It's easy to work with. It's a good choice. And you're going to need a set of hinges. I have these cheap little decorative brass, antiqued brass hinges. But you can get a cheap set from Walmart. That's fine. All right, what tools are you going to need? Well, obviously, you're going to need a saw. Now, I'm going to use my table saw because it's quick and easy, but you could use a hand saw if you wanted. It just takes some practice to be able to make nice straight cuts with it, and honestly, I'm a little out of practice with my hand sawing. You could use a miter saw, you could use a circular saw, a radial arm saw. If you had to, you could probably even use a jigsaw, but probably a table saw or a circular saw is going to be your best option for this. We're just making this with some simple crosscuts. You're probably going to want a drill or a drill and impact driver. You're going to need a screwdriver of some kind. If you're working with pine, like I am, you might actually be able to get away with skipping the drill and just using a screwdriver to drive the screws right in, because pine is really soft. You may or may not be able to do that, but having a drill is handy. You're going to need a tape measure, pretty obviously, to measure things with. And it's best to have some kind of square. This is just an inexpensive one. I probably picked this up at Walmart. I bet they're like $5, if that. And you're going to want some masking tape or blue painter's tape. I prefer blue painter's tape. And of course, some wood glue. I happen to have wood glue here. It doesn't have to be wood glue. White PVA glue. This is just like regular Elmer's glue, like you'd get off the shelf, or Walmart school glue or whatever. It's all the same thing. I'm going to use the Titebond Quick and Thick because it dries more quickly and it'll help me get this project moving along. All right, before you do anything else, the first thing you want to do is check and make sure the end of your board is square. It's not always going to be square from the big box stores, so you just want to make sure that's squared off so you got a nice square edge to start with. All right, the first thing you want to do after squaring up the end of your board is decide how long you want to make your box. Now, I decided on 10 inches. So I'm going to measure mine to 10 inches here. It can be any length you want. And one of the beauties of this project is all your measurements are going to be based off either the thickness of your board or the length of this original cut. So I'm going to come up here with my square and bring that marking all the way up. Now, it's a good idea when you make a mark like this, you want to make sure you know which side of the line you're cutting on, because the kerf of the saw, the thickness of the saw blade, is actually going to come out of this. So if you put like a little hash mark or something like that, or little X's, just to indicate that this is the side of the board you want the blade to be on. Before using any power tool, make sure you have your protective equipment: air protection, breathing protection, and safety glasses. All right, a little pro tip here: if you're using a circular saw or even a jigsaw, and I do have the battery out of this so it's safe to put my hands near the blade, you can measure from one of the teeth to the edge of your guide, and this is just under 3.5, so 15-30 seconds you could call it. And then what you can do is you can measure up on your board that same distance. Let's say this is where I want to cut. I can measure up 3 and 15-30 seconds and put a mark right there. And now you can attach a straight edge to your piece, either with clamps or with double-sided tape. And that way, when you go to make the cut, you're putting your guide right up against that straight edge, and you know you get a nice straight cut out of it. And honestly, I just had this thought. I'm going to write 3 and 15-30 seconds right on the side of the blade guard, so I know I don't have to think anymore about what that distance is. All right, I'm going to write bottom on this piece, just so I remember this is my bottom piece. Now here's the trick. Instead of taking the tape measure and using that to measure your next piece, what you're going to do is take the first piece that you cut, put it against the board, and strike your line off of that. Now, you know, even if your measurement was slightly off on this, it could be slightly off when you go to measure again. This way, you know you're making exactly the same. And then after we cut this, we'll use the bottom piece again to mark the length for the next piece. Okay, so now we're going to glue up our sides to our bottom. Now, if you have clamps, you can clamp these in place, and I'm gluing it so the sides are on top of the bottom. This is for a couple of reasons. First of all, that way we know when we make the sides, the end pieces, that we have to make them the same thickness of the board. So basically, we don't have to measure that thickness. That's just going to be the thickness of the board, which we already have. We'll just have to figure out how long to cut them. And also this way, it's going to hide the end grain. There's going to be very little end grain that you can see on this, which will make it a little bit nicer to look at. Now you can clamp these, or you can use blue painter's tape to clamp them. So if you don't have any wood clamps, I'm going to show you how to do this. I'm going to take a couple of really long strips of blue painter's tape. I have this wide stuff on hand. You don't need to use the wide stuff. You can use the regular stuff, or even just regular masking tape. We'll get this done just as well. You don't want to use Scotch tape, obviously. Or what's the generic name for Scotch tape? Transparent tape or something like that? My goodness, that's one of those words, Scotch tape, that is a brand that has become synonymous with the item, like Band-Aids or Xerox. Do people still say Xerox? I don't know if they still say Xerox or not, but they still say Band-Aid. And obviously, well, maybe not obviously, they still say Scotch tape. So we're going to glue, you know what? I'm going to put this knot out. It'll add a little character. So what we'll do is we're going to glue that, and then we're going to bring the tape up here and secure this in place with the tape. It's very easy. Now I'm going to use this glue here. Like I said, any white glue will do for this. If you want, you can add screws to the bottom to add a little more strength to the joint. But you're not really going to need to for this. I think the strength of the glue will be plenty for this project. All right, I need something I can squirt some glue out onto. This bottle's almost empty. I'm gonna get me some more quick and thick. These are really handy if you're going to be doing any kind of regular woodworking for applying your glue. They do a really great job, and because they're made out of silicone, the glue doesn't adhere to them. So when it dries, you can just pick it off. So cleaning them up afterwards is super easy. Now, as far as how much glue to use, you ask a bunch of different people and you'll get a bunch of different answers. You want a nice, even coat across the piece. Some people absolutely want to see a lot of squeeze out, which means they've used plenty. I'm not sure how necessary that is, and in this case, I'm going to avoid doing it because the more glue you have in there, the pieces are going to tend to shift. And because we're not using actual clamps, we're just doing this with a blue tape method, I want as little motion as possible out of these boards. So I don't want them wiggling if I can help it. So just using the tape to hold them in place will be better. It'll be better to use less glue if we're just using the tape to hold them in place. And I can see this is off just a little bit, so we got to shift that over. One thing you can do, I've heard, to stop your boards from shifting when you're doing glue up is to add a tiny bit of salt or sawdust into the joint, basically to add a little bit of bite in there, texture. Is that the word? A little bit of grit. I want a little bit of grit to hold it in place. My tape is getting less and less sticky as I keep taping and untaping. All right, that seems pretty good. Now, like I said, you can also, you can use screws through here if you want to make sure it's nice and secure. You could run screws up through the bottom, and then you don't really even have to worry about clamping it or taping it in place. The screws themselves will work as clamps. You don't need to glue both sides of the board necessarily. I might with this, but some people do. Like, honestly, you ask a bunch of different people about glue up, and you'll get all kinds of crazy different answers. Some people will tell you you have to glue both sides. Some people will tell you you don't have to glue both sides. Some people will say you absolutely have to see lots of squeeze out. Some people will say squeeze out is a problem. So it's one of those things. You'll just have your own experiences with it, and you'll get it to where it works for you. And this also brings up a point about clamping something for a glue up. You do not have to put tons of pressure. Honestly, the little bit of pressure that this tape is putting on here is plenty for this glue. All right, now let's cut our end pieces. Now this is where measuring the actual thickness of the board really matters, because since this width is just the width of the board, then the length of the end cut is going to be this length plus this thickness. So we can actually just throw a tape measure on that and see that we've got 6 1/4. Just a hair under 6 1/4. Not quite to the 1/8. So we're going to cut it. Sometimes you'll call that a short 6 1/4. So we're going to call that 6 1/4. So let's measure that out on this. So there's 6 1/4, and it was just a tiny bit, just a shade under 6 1/4. So we'll mark that on there. All right, now let's cut these. Oh, look at that. Beautifully flush. Beautifully flush with the top there. Now, before I do anything else, before I glue the ends on, I'm going to take a minute and just measure this length here. So that is about 11 1/2, just a hair after. And that's going to be the length of the top, so I'm going to cut the top right now. All right, now we have all of our pieces cut. Look at that. Look how pretty that is. So now let's get the ends glued on. All right, one thing you'll have noticed as I was doing this glue up and the taping is that I put the tape on it like this to pull this side in a little bit, because this piece was leaning out just a tiny bit. Now that could be because the factory cut wasn't square. I didn't check that. That's something you can run into. It could be that the glue was swelling up the wood fibers a little bit and making it not sit perfectly flat. Regardless, when your tolerances are already nice and good like this, it's no problem just to throw a little extra tape in there to square it up. All right, now let's attach our hinges. I threw a piece of tape to hold the top on. Obviously, it's not getting glued in place, but that just makes it easier to have it there. Now you have to decide, you probably want to make sure that this stays pretty even. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure over, and let's call that 2.5 inches. So I'm going to make a mark on here that's 2.5 inches in. And now I'm going to mark 2.5 inches from this side. You know what? It's easier to do it this way. All right, and that is where I'm going to put that side of the hinge on each of those so that they'll be evenly spaced. Now you just want to make sure that the hinge is straight with the box, with that line on the box, and you're just going to mark where your screws are going to go. Hopefully I'm not getting my arm in the way so you can see what I'm doing here. If you wanted to, you could use a little drop of super glue to anchor the hinge onto the box to draw your little circles. That's also acceptable. Okay, now I'm going to drill some really teeny tiny little pilot holes, and the key to drilling a pilot hole, obviously I'm not using this screw, is that you want your drill bit to be the thickness of the shaft of the screw, smaller than the flutes. So that way the flutes will have something to grab into, but the screw can enter the wood nicely. Again, this is pine, so I probably could just drive the screws right into it without any trouble. But let's do it properly and make some little pilot holes. Now I have this drill bit sunk all the way down into here, so I know that I'm not going to go too deep with them. But one thing you can do is put a little piece of tape around the drill bit for as far down as you want to go, so that makes sure you don't go too deep with them. Now, if this was a hardwood or like a bigger project, this is where I would get my impact driver out. Once again, this is pine and we're dealing with some really tiny, tiny screws here. So I'm just going to run them in by hand. It's a good idea to leave that first screw a little bit loose, so that way you've got some motion in the hinge there. With these little hinges, it's not really going to matter much, but if you're dealing with like a bigger, heavier hinge, and you rank that screw all the way down nice and tight, then it's not going to be able to swivel and you won't be able to line up your other holes if you need to make a minor adjustment. You want to be careful with softer woods like pine. If you crank down too hard on that screw, you could strip out the hole. I mean, the worst case scenario there is you relocate your hinge and you make new holes. Maybe go with a smaller drill bit. Worst case scenario, if you're drilling into hardwood, you might shear the head right off the screw. And then, as they say, you're screwed. All right, and there we have it, the most basic box that you can possibly make. If you want to try your hand at woodworking and you're not sure if you're going to like it or not, or maybe you need a little box and you just want the satisfaction of making it yourself, that's the basic box. Now, let's talk about finishing, and then I'm going to talk about some extras we can do. All right, let's talk about putting a finish on your nice new box. Now, you don't actually have to put a finish on it. You can just use it as it is, raw wood. The thing about raw wood is it does tend to soak up oil and dirt, so it could get looking beat up and grungy pretty quickly. Maybe that's what you want. If you want to change the color of it, of course, you can get wood stain. This is a walnut color. They make cherry, mahogany, all sorts of different colors, rainbows colors, blacks, whites, whatever you're looking for, you can change the color of the box. You do want to be careful with pine, because pine does not always take stains evenly. If you look at, you can see the rings with the darker and lighter, they're going to absorb the stain differently, so you're going to get variegated color in there. So that's just something you want to be mindful of. Of course, you can just paint it too if you'd like. Just get some whatever kind of paint, some latex paint or some acrylic paint, and just paint it up. Now, if you want to keep the wood looking color, the quickest, easiest way to do a finish is with a spray-on lacquer or polyurethane, and especially the lacquer dries super quick, so you'll be ready to go very quickly. These won't change the color of the box a lot. Every finish will darken it a little bit. These are probably the least, the polyurethane a little bit more than the lacquer. Now, there is a whole host of different oils This is boiled linseed oil. It's been around forever. It's been used to treat wood forever. This is tried and true. This is also a linseed. It's polymerized, not boiled. Long story short, it's similar. And this also has beeswax in it to add some toughness to the finish. This is feed and wax. This is an orange oil with beeswax in it. I like using this a lot. And again, there's tung oil, there's walnut oil, there's all sorts of different oils you can finish this with. But I am going to finish my box with some shellac. This is actually the excrement of the lac bug. You mix it with, you cut it with wood grain alcohol, my friends. You mix this with Everclear and thin it down. It comes in flakes, they'll dissolve in the liquid, and this dries super fast. And the nice thing about shellac is it's easy to repair because every new coat of shellac dissolves the coat underneath it a little bit, so it'll blend very nicely. That's a really quick primer on finishes. Let's talk about some upgrades you can do to your box. All right, I wanted to add a latch onto the front of my little box here. The process is very similar to the hinges. You mark your screw holes, drill them out, and put the screws in. Your choices here are, once again, endless. You can go with something very simple. You can do fancy. You can do antique brass. You can do chrome-plated silver. I wanted to add one of these, I forget the name of it, type of hasps to it, clasps. The ones where you flip this thing up and take that out like that. So that's what I'm going to use on this. Now, another little upgrade you can add is these little corner feet. Again, you just mark the holes and put the nails or screws in. I don't have any in the antique brass, so I'm not going to add them to this. But as you can see, they add a nice little touch of elegance to your project. Another little trick you can do is add a piece of chain or string or twine, either on the inside or the outside, so the top will only open so far, and then when it closes, it just dangles there or falls down inside the box. And what if you want a little handle on top of your little box? Well, you could go out and buy one, or you could cut one out of the scrap wood you have left over and make that for your handle. Just put it on top, mark it where you want it, drill holes through, and then run screws up from underneath. Or you could get a piece of rope, drill 2 holes, put the rope through, tie knots, you've got a nice little handle that way. Or you could do this on the sides with obviously a smaller piece of rope than what I've got here. Look, this is the only rope I had on hand, okay? All right, my friends, and that is it for our very basic box. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down in the comments below. It's a fun little project. I hope you have fun with it too. I am actually going to sand this a little bit to take out some of those pencil lines and soften these edges a little bit. That's one of the things you might want to do is take some sandpaper and break these edges just a little bit, kind of round them over. And then I'm going to put some shellac on it, and I will see you in the next video.